Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for joining us. Amy and Brian, thank you for setting all this up. And most of all, Micah, thank you. We love you. We're so grateful to you. I think all of us love Israel deeply. All of us are very confused about Israel, and all of us are very concerned about Israel. And we don't really have categories to help us understand what's happening, but we do have you. So take it away and tell us about Israel now.
I think the best way to think about the past year or so, or the past 8 months, Jews, Israelis, anyone around the world that loves Israel has noticed that Israel is under not one, but two different kinds of threats. One threat is that Israel will not be a democracy anymore. That's one threat, that Israel will turn into an illiberal democracy or into a dictatorship, some kind of a form of Poland or Hungary or Turkey. That's one threat, and people are very anxious that this is some process that's happening in Israel. And at the other side of this process, Israel is not the country we love. It's not the country we always supported. It's not what we want it to be. It's not what we need it to be for us. But there's a different threat, a very different threat, a very different strategic threat to our future. And that is not that Israel will turn into a dictatorship, but Israel will just collapse, deteriorate into small tribes that can't understand each other, hate each other, and can't work together. And which would lead, like, this is the image that this all leads to civil war. And that's a different threat. It's not that we become Hungary, it's that we become Lebanon, like a dysfunctional society where people hate each other and fight with each other. So what's the threat, Hungary or Lebanon? Dictatorship or anarchy and civil war? What's the threat? What's really frightening? And maybe I'll put it differently. Let's try to put more words to these two threats. The threat of Israel becoming Turkey or Hungary is based on the idea that this government takes over the court system, takes over the Supreme Court. It takes over, well, we won't go on. We spoke a few times how this government was planning to do, right? And if it takes over the Supreme Court and in Israel, where we have no vertical checks and balances and no horizontal checks and balances. We've talked about this. And the only thing we have is the Supreme Court to protect our rights from the power of government. Well, if the Supreme Court is a part of that government, nothing can protect us from that government, and we lost the protection of our liberty. So that's the vision of Israel turning into Hungary or a dictatorship is us losing our liberty. The image that Israel is divided into two groups that can't understand each other, despise each other, and are willing to fight each other, maybe even violently. The Israel turning into Lebanon, that's Israel losing its unity. So here's a big question, Rabbi Wes. What's really the threats? Losing our liberty or losing our unity? And it's important to create this distinction, because if we're aware of only one threat, we might materialize the other one. I'll give you an example. If because of unity, we don't want to be protesting against the government because we don't want to piss them off, because we all have to hug each other and kumbaya and stay together. So because in the name of unity, we'll be losing our liberty. Option number two, if our liberty feels so threatened, and we're willing to do such radical actions to protect our liberty, we might find ourselves fracturing Israel and destroying our unity. So we have here two threats, and it's very hard to maneuver between these two threats, because what we want Israel is united and free. We want our liberty and our basic sense of unity, that Zionism is still alive, and as a nation state, it can still function and work together and to fulfill our goals and our vision of Israel. So those are two threats. Now, what's happening in Israel now? I want to just think about this through these two threats. So what's happening this week in Israel is very hard to explain. It's very hard to understand. I'll give it my best shot. So, and I want to rely on the fact that we had some conversations about this. So here it is. In the past, in 1949, Israelis went to vote not for the Knesset, not for the parliament, but for our version of your constitutional convention in Philadelphia. We went to vote for our representatives in our constitutional convention. And they got together and said, let's design a constitution. And then we'll ratify the constitution. And then we'll have a constitution. And then we'll go to elections, vote for parliament, and start legislating in light of the constitution. That's what we're supposed to do. That is what our Declaration of Independence ordered us to do. That was after the war was over, 1949. I think it was January, but it was February. You could Wikipedia this afterwards or Google this afterwards. The Constitutional Convention got together and then they did something weird. They said, you know what? Let's not design a constitution. And let's not go through the process of ratifying the constitution. So he said, so what should we do? Let's just start legislating laws. But that's the role of a parliament that will be founded by the constitution. That's not, let's just do it anyway. Let's just do it anyway. Okay. We spoke about that moment where our constitutional convention turned into, it's just imagine like the people in Philadelphia when they went where they convened to design a constitution. Imagine they would say to themselves, you know what? Let's just call ourselves the Congress and start creating laws. It sounds weird. It sounds like that's not supposed to happen. That's exactly what we did in 1949. That's what we did. Now, why did Ben-Gurion do that? I think he had good reasons to do that, by the way. He had good reasons to do that. Israel had to triple its size. We had a wave of immigration coming in. Israel had to double its size within 3 years. I think there's 330 million people in the United States of America. Can America take in 330 million immigrants in 3 years? And this is America of abundance. We're talking about poor Israel, third world country, has to absorb, it's double its size in 3 years. Ben-Gurion was like, I don't need a constitution now. I need flexibility. I don't need boundaries to government. And I understand. I think that was, I was thinking about it. So Ben-Gurion, I think this is what he said. He said, we're supposed to design a constitution. We're not going to do it. We have bigger challenges. The constitution is for the future of Israel. The decision they did make was the following. Instead of designing a constitution, let's decide that the constitution is actually going to be a project in process, meaning they created a committee called Vadat Chukah Chok V'Mishpat, like a committee that its role is to design a constitution. And every time they decide one chapter of the constitution, we call that chapter a basic law. So it's trying to create basic law. The basic law defines the authority of the Knesset. The basic law defines the authority of Israel's president. The basic law defines the role of the military. And they start creating basic laws throughout the years. And the idea was, one day, all these basic laws will be canonized and turned into our constitution, and then we'll have a constitution. Now, here's the big question that nobody really knew the answer to. Until all the basic laws are done, and until we wrap them all up in one document and we call the Constitution, until then, do these basic laws have constitutional authority? As chapters of the future Constitution, do they already today, before the future Constitution, do they have constitutional authority? So in 1995, Aharon Barak said that yes, the answer is yes. These basic laws have constitutional authority. Which means if a basic law contradicts if a regular law contradicts a basic law, so the Supreme Court could strike down the regular law, right? Because it has constitutional authority. So that was made clear only by 1995. But here's the problem and here's the catch. While Aharon Barak decides that basic laws have constitutional authority, which means you could use them to strike down regular laws, he decided that while in real life, in the parliament, in the Knesset, the process of creating a regular law and the process of creating a basic law is the same process exactly. You need a regular majority to create a regular law, and a regular majority to create a basic law. A regular law passes 3 hearings in the Knesset. A basic law passes 3 hearings in the Knesset. So you need the same process and the same majority to create a basic law, which has constitutional authority that could strike down a regular law, even though they're both created using the same process. So now we're moving down to 2023. And we have the following problem. We're looking backwards and we realize if the basic laws trump regular laws, while the process that creates it is just like the process of regular laws, we have a problem. The problem is the Knesset could call any law it wants a basic law. Just calls it a basic law and injects constitutional authority to that law. Okay, so this would mean that a Knesset could decide, hey, it's a good idea that only Ashkenazim pay taxes and Sephardim don't pay taxes. It creates that law, legislates it, and calls it a basic law. So if it's a basic law, so it has constitutional authority, it means that the Supreme Court can't strike it down because it's a basic law, it has constitutional authority. So that's the problem that we're in now in Israel. It's a constitutional problem that basic laws with constitutional authority, the kind of constitutional authority that on the one hand, the Supreme Court can't strike it down, but on the other hand, that it can use the basic law to strike down regular laws, that basic law is created using a regular majority. So that's, okay, now that's the big question that our Supreme Court has to answer this week. Is any law that the Knesset creates, calls a basic law, means the Supreme Court can't strike it down because it's a basic law and not a regular law, even though, so here's the problem. The person that decided that a basic law is constitutional is Aaron Barak, the Supreme Court. Now the Supreme Court realizes that Knesset are overusing and maybe abusing this system, so they want to strike down basic. So they're debating if they can strike down a basic law. Now, what's really happening? That's the constitutional, geeky constitutional introduction. But how is this thing played out in Israel today? So, if you're afraid of Israel's liberty, so you would say the following: the Supreme Court has to protect Israeli civilians from a parliament that can legislate any law it wants, call it a basic law, and then that law will enjoy immunity from intervention of the Supreme Court. So if that trick, calling any law a basic law, means that law can't be struck down, and to create that law, all you need is a regular majority, so any government can just use the parliament to destroy human rights, to use its power against human rights and call it a basic law, and then it's protected from the Supreme Court. So that's the threat on our liberty. On the other hand, here's how it's being played out. The Israeli right have the following narrative, and that is that for many years, any decision of the government was struck down by the Supreme Court because decisions of the government or laws of the Knesset contradicted basic laws. So basic laws gave the Supreme Court the power to strike down regular laws of the Knesset. Who gave the Supreme Court the power to strike down basic laws? See, basic laws are the source of the power of the Supreme Court. Therefore, the Supreme Court cannot have power to strike down basic laws because it's the source of their own power. I hope this is clear. So what people in the right are saying, if the Supreme Court strikes down a basic law, they're actually saying that the Supreme Court has complete is superiority over the Knesset. And it could just, and the problem is the Supreme Court are 15 people that weren't elected by the people. The Knesset is 120 people that were elected by the people. So by putting the Supreme Court over the Knesset, you're saying that an unelected body is controlling an elected body, and therefore if this passes, if they strike down a basic law, That's like saying that we are not a democracy anymore. So here we have two narratives. The center right, center left, the coalition that's against the judicial overhaul, are saying that if the Knesset could create basic laws and there be protected from intervention of the Supreme Court, Israel won't be a democracy anymore. People on the right are saying, if the Supreme Court can strike down basic laws, so the Supreme Court, which is not elected, controls the Knesset that was elected, if that happens, we're not a democracy anymore. So here we have, entering this week in Black September, two narratives. The narrative that's against this government is that the Supreme Court doesn't have the legitimacy to strike down basic laws. Israel's not a democracy anymore. On the right, the narrative is that if it does strike down basic laws, Israel is not democracy anymore. So notice this, Rabbi West, how two Israels are living in two opposite stories. And so which means that no matter what the decision of the Supreme Court is going to be, a large part of the country will feel Israel stopped being a democracy. If the Supreme Court does not have the right to override basic laws, people that are against this government will say, this is it. This is it. The Knesset can legislate whatever it wants with a regular majority, call it a basic law, and my rights are not protected anymore. We're not a democracy anymore. I have nothing to do with this country anymore. On the other side, if the Supreme Court knocks down basic laws, means our elected politicians have no power. The unelected judges have all the power. It's an aristocracy. We're not a democracy anymore. This is not our Israel anymore. So we have here two Israels living in two different narratives, two different images of reality. So what's the real threat here? The threat to our liberty, meaning we're downhill towards Hungary, or the threat to our unity? Two Israels living in two narratives, can't understand each other anymore, and we clash into Lebanon. These are the two threats that we are facing. I just want to say one thing. This is not going to materialize. I mean, the hearing of the Supreme Court is on Tuesday, but they're not going to come out with an answer on Tuesday. So Israel is not going to be either Hungary or Lebanon this Tuesday. It will probably happen after the Chagim. We have a lot to pray for in the Chagim, after the Chagim. But these are the two main threats. Now, my position is the following. My position, personally, individually, Micha, is that the two threats to our liberty or our unity have stories of their own. And I think in March, whoever's following the story, in March, the threat to our unity was low and to our liberty was high. In March, when the government was about to legislate the reform of, or the judicial overhaul of Yariv Levin, which had many components, and they wanted to go through the whole thing and take over the Supreme Court, our threat to our liberty was alive, and the threat to our unity was less. Now I think the threat to our liberty, the immediate threat to our liberty is low. It's low because the entire judicial overhaul we're not trying to pass it now. Only one component, which is relatively a minor component. The rest of the components might come back. So the threat to our liberty didn't disappear, but it's not urgent. On the other hand, that's the threat to our liberty. The threat to our unity is alive. It's alive. It's real. It's immediate. I would say my best articulation of what's happening to our unity in Israel is that we stopped having an argument and we started having a fight. We're not in war. We're not in civil war, but we're not in arguments. We're in the middle. We're having a fight now. As a nation, we're having a fight. And what's the difference between an argument and a fight? You know, when a kid asks his parents, why are you fighting? And the parents say, we're not fighting, we're just having an argument. Parents have a tendency to deny the fact that they're fighting. We're just having a discussion. We're just having an argument. We have those kind of memories. So I think it's time to tell Israelis when it's the other way around. We're not having an argument, we're having a fight. In an argument, both sides are trying to convince each other. In a fight, both sides are trying to hurt each other. And I think we're having a fight. That fight that we're having is injuring our military. We're losing this. The right is attacking the legitimacy of the military. On the left, they are promoting not showing up to the military. Our military is weakening. Our economy is weakening. Our ties with the world are weakening, meaning this fight is making Israel a weaker country. And the more the fight gets worse, the weaker our country is. And I'm afraid that a point in time will come when our enemies will realize how weak we are, diplomatically, economically, and militarily, and maybe say, maybe this is, I'm not saying they'll make this decision, I'm saying they could make this decision. Maybe this is the right time to give the Zionists one, like a strategic maluma, a strategic blow to Zionism, to Israel. I'm afraid that our enemies are debating that right now as we're talking. I think they still have a lot to lose, and they know that. But this is the reason why the Israeli military said that the chances for war in 2023 are the highest they were ever since 2006. In 2006, we had the war in Lebanon. The chances for war were never as high as they are today ever since 2006. So cracking our liberty is also putting us in jeopardy, our security in jeopardy. So that's, I think, where we are today. Finally, so I think, this is me, there are two threats to our unity and to our liberty. The threat to our liberty, thanks to a very, very effective protest movement, the threat to our liberty has been, the level of threat went down, the threat to our unity went up. The implications of our threat to unity, which are strategic, are going up too, meaning security risks. This is all happening in Israel today. Finally, I know I have 7 more minutes. Finally, if you'll speak to real Israelis on the ground, you'll see a lot of unity. If you see Israelis on social media, you'll see a lot of hate. If you'll see youth movements in schools, you'll see right-wingers, left-wingers, religion, secular, that get along with each other. You go on Facebook, you'll see they can't understand each other. There's also 2 Israels here. And there's digital Israel, and there's real-life Israel. There are 2 very different Israels. But after saying that, I want to offer here a theory I have. And Israel has a very tough year to survive. A very tough year to get through. Or maybe 2 years. When we have to balance threats to our liberty and to our unity. But if we survive these 3 years, under, giving my personal opinion, this very, probably, I think, of all of history, Israel's history, we had many governments. I think this is the worst government we've ever had. A government that is putting our liberty and our unity at risk, making Israel weaker and therefore vulnerable to our enemies. This is not one of the worst governments we've ever had. It's the worst government we've ever had. But what designs a future is not only events, it's also the way we remember events. The memory of events designs the future, at least as, if not more than, the events themselves. And I think what's happening, I think we talked about this, but I just want to refresh our mind, is that after this government ends, I think Israelis are going to carry a serious trauma from an extreme right-wing government. This is the most extreme right-wing government we've ever had. I think we're developing a trauma from extreme right-wing government. Let me try to explain this point. For many years, if you ask people on the right, you're in power for 40 years. Why isn't Israel the utopia you promised us? Why isn't Israel heaven on earth? The right has been in power ever since, on and off, ever since 1977. Most governments were right-wing governments. The answer is because we were never really in power. Because there was always a centrist, a liberal, a leftist in the government balancing the coalition, blocking our ability to implement pure right-wing ideology. And a fantasy was created called Memshelet Yamin al-Maneh. That's in Hebrew, a full, pure right-wing government. That's a fantasy that was created in Israel for many years. Now, Rabbi, you know what's the best way to ruin a fantasy? To implement it. That's the best way to destroy a fantasy, to implement it. And now what we're having in Israel is an implementation of a extreme, pure right-wing government. And it doesn't seem like it's heaven. It seems like it's hell. It doesn't seem like it's a utopia. It seems like it's a dystopia. Now, what I'm saying now is not what left-wingers think of this government. This is what 50% of Likud people feel about this government. Likud voters feel about this government, which means that after this government, the idea of a pure right-wing government that used to be a fantasy regarding the future will start being just a bad memory to be had in the past, something we will not want to repeat. Now, we know how this looks like when Israelis develop an allergic reaction to a certain form of coalition. We know what it looks like when Israelis develop an allergic reaction to a certain kind of ideology, because we've done this before and we went through this before. In the 90s, we had left-wing coalitions that tried to implement pure left-wing ideology. And when they tried to implement pure left-wing ideology and to implement it to legitimize Yasser Arafat and to create a two-state solution, so this is the way it's experienced by most Israelis. When a left-wing government in the 90s tried to implement left-wing ideology and implement it on reality, what happened was when you love ideology, trying to implement ideology on reality, sometimes you're blinded by ideology and you can't see reality. What happens then, reality rebels and destroys the ideology. And that's what happened in the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada was a blow for Israeli left-wing ideology. And the Israeli left never recovered from the Second Intifada. Israelis have a trauma from the Second Intifada, which is experienced as trauma from left-wing coalitions. I think what's happening now in Israel is what the Second Intifada did to the left, this internal chaos is going to do to the extreme right, creating a trauma from pure extreme right-wing ideology. And after this government, Israelis are not going to be like, hey, let's move back to the left. No. What's happening now is we used to have in our baggage, we're carrying a trauma from the left. Now you'll be carrying a trauma from the right and the extreme right. Now we'll have Israel post this bad government. Israelis will be carrying not one but two traumas: trauma from the left and a trauma from the extreme right. And I think these two forces, these two traumatic memories, will be directing Israel towards large, balanced, centrist governments. That is, I think, that is a prediction I have, but there is a caveat to this prediction. If you look at Israel demographically, Israel 20, 25 years from now, it looks like Israel is very orthodox, very right-wing, and very Messianic, which means this government gave us the taste, the future, before the future. The good news is we got to taste the future before the future, and we don't like how it tastes. And it's creating a traumatic memory. Then we have 20 years to build centrist governments that can avoid that future. If this happens, Rabbi, this very bad government is not an image of the future before the future, is what we needed in order to prevent that future. And if that's true, so I think the best way to think about this very bad government, it's a vaccine. It's a vaccine. Remember how vaccines work. Vaccine works, you actually, remember when you got a vaccine for COVID, we were like sick for 48 hours. We were sick because you have to taste the flavor of the disease in order to develop immunity to that disease. I think what we're having in Israel now is a vaccine, and it hurts. We're developing immunity towards extreme right-wing ideologies and governments. The thing is, and here's a question I don't have an answer to, what happens if you take an overdose of the vaccine? So the vaccine that's supposed to protect you from the disease, that the vaccine itself will get at you, will kill you. So I don't know. I think there's good chances that this very bad government is creating immunity among Israelis that directs us to balanced centrist governments and balanced centered governments, the kind of governments that could shrink the conflict of the Palestinians, be pragmatic, get a lot of things done, create a great Israel, those kind of governments. And I guess to get to those kind of governments, we have to go through, have an allergic reaction to the left from the 90s. And after that, balance that with an allergic reaction to the far right. And then we're moving to the center, I think, and to develop the kind of Israel we can all be partners in. But in order to create this traumatic memory, we have to go through this very, very painful period, which we need to survive to get to the other side. And surviving that means surviving this while our liberty is protected by the Supreme Court and our unity is protected from radical protesters that are doing everything to. So anyway, we have to go through this very, very confusing period to protect our unity. So we are one nation that has a Supreme Court that's independent, so it's also a free nation. That's our big challenge now. Sadly, people that speak about unity don't see liberty. People that see only liberty don't see the problems that the battle for liberty are causing for a unity. We're not balancing it well enough. We are, and as a result, right now, as we're talking, the chance that Israel turns into Hungary is low, into Lebanon is high, and the reason is that we have a constitutional sensitive situation where two different groups in Israel have very different understanding of reality. It's almost like they live in different realities. So that's, I think we have time for some questions, but that's my best attempt to try to understand the potential of this moment, the dangers of this moment. And again, all this is not going to explode this week. It will only when the Supreme Court comes with this decision. So if there won't be any compromise by then, a large part of Israel will feel like their decision means the end of Israel as a democracy. If they strike down a basic law, the right will feel like Israel's not a democracy anymore. If they don't, people that are against this government will feel like, okay, nothing can protect us from this government, from this racist government, and Israel's not a democracy anymore. So we're really, and by the way, I think they're both wrong. They're both exaggerating. But it doesn't matter. We're in a moment of exaggeration, a moment of a binary moment, a moment of all or nothing, and that's the clash. That's the clash we're in now. But it will only happen after the Chagim, and hopefully we have the Chagim to calm things down and maybe reach a compromise in the meantime.
Great. So Micah, first of all, thank you for this so thoughtful and heartfelt sharing. Few quick questions. First, could you talk about the phrase Black September? Because it sounds like the one thing that Israel has in common is that all the different camps you mentioned regard this as Black September. So could you talk about how that phrase came to be and what it means, that that's the one thing that unites everybody, that it's Black September?
So there's two things happening this September. One, see, I'm confused with the times, but I think I'm confusing sometimes. I think it was 2 months ago when a sizable group of pilots that are in reserves declared that they're not showing up. They're not showing up to their training. And that means that now it's a sizable group, and our Air Force needs them. It needs them. It needs them to train, because if you don't train for a month, 2 months, 3 months, you're disqualified. So I think one reason it's Black September is like, okay, in September, all these pilots might be disqualified. These pilots disqualified, or Air Force is weaker, is much weaker. Black September is also the moment where the Supreme Court will make a decision that many Israelis will interpret as ending Israel as a liberal democracy as we know it, from both sides, no matter what the decision is. So you put both these together, and here's how I'm thinking about this. What does it mean to live in a liberal country, in a liberal state? So I think a liberal state are both answers to different sets of anxieties that human beings have. We have one kind of anxiety, the kind of anxiety that gave birth to the idea of a state, of a government. We're afraid of other people. We're afraid of other countries. We're afraid of terrorists. We're afraid of thieves. We're afraid of murderers. And we need a government to protect us. Government to have power to protect us. In Israel, we're afraid of a hostile Middle East, Iran, Hezbollah, and we need a strong government to protect us from the bad people. Okay, that's one fear that creates the fear that according to Thomas Hobbes, is a kind of the fear that gives legitimacy to government. But there's another fear. It's not the fear of an external threat and need the government to protect me from that threat. Liberal people like John Locke, John Stuart Mill say, I also have to fear the government itself. So I need the government to have power to protect me, but I also have to be protected from the government. So which means we want two things. People living in liberal countries, you want two things. We want to be protected by the government, we want to be protected from the government. That's a double protection. So if you're an Israeli, this is how it looks like. Be protected by the government from Hezbollah and Iran means we need a strong air force. If you want to be protected from the government, I need a strong Supreme Court. What is Black September? It's a moment where many Israelis feel like the Supreme Court is not protecting me from the government anymore, and the Air Force is not protecting me from Iran anymore. I have no more protection. I'm not protected by the government because the government has a weaker Air Force and it can't protect me from the bad people of the Middle East. And the Supreme Court can't protect me from the government anymore. So I think Israelis have this healthy instinct that we need double protection. That's why we need a strong Air Force and a strong Supreme Court. You're protected through the government, by the government, also from the government. I think Black September is the moment where we're realizing, oh my God, are we losing our double protection? Are we losing it?
So, Micah, what follows from your talk is that the Supreme Court cannot actually solve the divide in Israel's neshama now, because either decision it makes leaves a big part of the country feeling like our democracy is over. So my question is, could you say a word about, given that reality, what's the politics like, the negotiation, the back, to channel Hamilton, the room where it happens? Is there anything happening in the room where it happens, discussions and negotiations that could take this away from the Supreme Court, because the court can't bring healing, can compromise and negotiation and political, horse trading, bring up peace that a decision of the court cannot bring?
It's a very good question. So the person trying to create a compromise is President Herzog. And President Herzog actually came up with a very good compromise. He's been working on this for a few months. And sadly, this always happens. His compromise was leaked like a few days before it was really ready. So his compromise was the following. It's not peace. There's on the other side of war, there's peace. But sometimes in the middle of the war, there's ceasefire. So President Herzog didn't think about like peace between Israelis. That's too much to ask for. But a ceasefire. The ceasefire, according to President Herzog's document, had four components. Component number one, the government declares that it will take I won't go into the plaza,
reasonableness.
The what?
The reasonableness.
The reasonableness clause, and legislate it again in a way that's more soft and more narrow. That's one. After it does that, it legislates another law, a basic law that says the following. Any other legislation regarding our Constitution can only pass with 80 members of the Knesset for the next a year and a half. De facto, creating a reality the next year and a half, this government cannot legislate anything without the opposition. Which means now for a year and a half, that threat on our liberty is now off the shelf. In the meantime, the Supreme Court will be asked not to go into negotiate, not to go through the process of canceling base clause. Oh, and they have to find, I won't go into it, but to find because the committee that chooses the judges of the Supreme Court has to convene, it will be convened in a way that the politicians can't take the Supreme Court, can't control the Supreme Court, and yet this coalition will have some kind of symbolic victory. I won't go to it now, it won't go to it now. It was it was actually a ceasefire that says this government is getting like 2% of what it wanted. and putting this whole overhaul aside. And here was the problem. Bibi's lawyer was signed on this document. His lawyer was. And also people that are very close to Bibi were signed on this document. But Bibi himself wasn't, which gave him space of deniability. And the first thing Bibi did when it was leaked, he said, I have nothing to do with this. So that created a chain reaction where Benny Gantz said, and Benny Gantz told the president that this compromise will be acceptable on him. Well, how can he accept something that Bibi himself doesn't stand behind? So he said, I have nothing to do with this either. And because of the leak, everyone turned their backs on this arrangement that they agreed to in the room where things happen, your Hamilton quote. Right. And now it seems like the compromise is dead. It's still going to come back to life in the next 24 hours, 48 hours. It's still going to, or maybe doing the chagim. It's still going to come back to life. But this is a classic problem we have. Both sides, I mean, the moderate parts of both sides know how the agreement looked like, and they're both afraid of the extreme parts of the other side. The extreme part of the protest movement says that you're not allowed to compromise this government. Actually, the leader of the protest movement says that compromising this government is being a Chamberlain. Okay, and compromising with the Nazis. She said Chamberlain. She also said okay, and so you can't, because this government is so disgusting. You can't negotiate this government, and there's no compromise, even if you're getting 98% of what you want. And people in this government saying that if we compromise, we're not the government anymore because we're giving up 98% of our demands. It's like we're giving up to the crazy leftists, elitists, blah blah, all that populist rhetoric. So the moderate parts of both camps are willing to compromise. I think the majority of Israelis, according to polls, want compromise, but both sides right now are hijacked rhetorically by the most extreme versions of their camps. That's the catch.
Wow. So, Micha, we have 1 minute left. Could you just tell us the effect of all this uncertainty on day-to-day life? I know, and before we came on, you shared that Beit Prat, where you're doing your teaching for Elul, is bigger than ever, better than ever. How do ordinary Israelis get on with their lives in the face of this uncertainty?
Life has power of its own, Rabbi. Life has power of its own. And while a lot of Israelis are very angry and terrified, sadly, I don't think enough Israelis are terrified from both threats that care about our unity and our liberty the same. Like, I don't think they're caring, but I think they understand this is all going on. And at the same time, you see many Israelis that know and understand that mainstream Israelis, moderate right-wingers, moderate left-wingers, radical centrists are much closer to each other than they are to the extreme versions of their camps. And you see this invisible consensus alive in Israel. You don't see it represented in politics. You don't see it represented in social media. You only see it in life itself. And here's a big question. Will the lack of health of Israeli politics destroy from the top down, destroy the healthy parts of Israeli society? Will the healthy parts of Israeli society from the bottom heal the Israeli politics on the top? Right now, it seems like the poisonous politics on the top is infiltrating all parts of Israel. But I think on the long term, again, if we survive this government, if we survive this divide, this moment of polarization, if we survive this, on the other side, I think we'll be immune to extremism. I see how moderate right-wingers are now realizing that people on the left are much closer to them than extreme right-wingers. I see this awakening happening. I think on the other side, we're developing immunity thanks to this vaccine. The question is, will this vaccine create immunity, or are we having an overdose of this vaccine that will danger our future? That is like the big question that we have to go through the next few weeks and months.
Well, Micha, can I just say on behalf of our community, two things. Number one, we just love you so much, and we just love Israel so much. And on our tefillot on the holidays, we are all going to be praying for beloved Eretz Israel. We pray for Israel every day, every Shabbos, every Chag, the Yamim Noraim. We're going to be just offering our choicest prayers and our love. And also, we are so grateful to you. We know how busy you are in Elul. Thank you so much for taking your time. We love you, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the other end of all of this. Lots of love. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.